Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. In this video we will take a look at an article by Briana Toole, and the article is called Demarginalizing Standpoint Epistemology. So, standpoint epistemology, Toole defines it as the view that social identity is relevant to knowledge acquisition. So the view that social identity is relevant to knowledge acquisition. And in the beginning of the paper, she points out that although standpoint epistemology is a lively area of research, it doesn't seem to have made a lot of impact on sort of mainstream epistemology. And so what she wants to do in this article is to argue that it should have more impact on mainstream epistemology, thus demarginalizing standpoint epistemology. Right? That's the title, and it's the purpose of the paper. So how does she do that? Well, Toole is going to set up a contrast, really, between a traditional element of epistemology, which she calls intellectualism on the one hand, and standpoint epistemology on the other hand. And this distinction or tension is going to allow us to better understand the point that standpoint epistemologists are making, and to see how and why it would impact maybe some of the traditional ideas that epistemologists have held. So what is intellectualism? Intellectualism is the thesis that knowledge does not depend on non-epistemic features. Okay, it's the thesis that knowledge does not depend on non-epistemic features. Well, it's a little bit hard to say what is an epistemic and what is a non-epistemic feature of a particular situation or a particular agent. At the end of the article, Toole is basically going to say that in the end it doesn't really matter, the distinction. Right? What she wants to say is that one's social identity is important for knowledge, and how we classify things as epistemic or non-epistemic isn't in the end the point. But for the sake of presentation, for the main part of the article, she is going to make this distinction between the non-epistemic and the epistemic. And so epistemic features of a situation, at the very least, include somebody's evidence, right? And so you can think of intellectualism as, in a sense, the following. Two people can get the same knowledge, right, if they have the same evidence, right? That would be sort of very roughly a sort of definition of intellectualism, right? And maybe there's more things that fall under epistemic features than just the evidence, but evidence is certainly going to be a very important part of that. On the other hand, among non-epistemic features, we could, for instance, think of somebody's purpose or aim or desire, right? My aim or desire is not an epistemic feature about me. And so if my aim or desire or purpose has some kind of influence on whether I can know something, then that would be a non-epistemic factor. And intellectualism would be in trouble if that's the case. Or, more importantly for standpoint epistemology, maybe my social identity is such a thing. Right? Maybe the fact that I am a man or a woman, or that I belong to a certain religion, well, religion is maybe more difficult, might have an epistemic element, belong to a certain racial or ethnic group, right? That could be a reason for, if that is relevant, like my ethnicity, for instance, if that's relevant for determining what knowledge I can get in a particular situation, that would be a non-epistemic factor. And so standpoint epistemology, as Toole understands it, takes an epistemic agent's social identity to be a non-epistemic factor that makes a difference to what she is in a position to know. Okay, so let's first delve into intellectualism a little bit more. Toole tells us that intellectualism consists of or goes along with like two very general ideas about knowledge that most traditional epistemologists have had. The first is aperspectivalism, and the second is atomism. So aperspectivalism is basically the idea that for something to be evidence, it must be accessible to other people. Right? If something is to be evidence, then other people would have to be able to have the same evidence. And so, for instance, like a public document, for instance, that I use as evidence for something, if other people can also use it as evidence, that would be aperspectival. But maybe even like pushing it a little bit, something that I have seen, right? If other people in the same circumstances would have seen the same thing, I suppose that could still count as aperspectival, right? It's not something that sort of belongs essentially to me or to my social group or something like that. It's something that other people could also have had. And I can tell other people about it, and they know what I mean, and they can sort of use it as in the same way that I use the evidence. So that's sort of this aperspectivalism. And it's very closely connected to this second idea, which is the atomism. And the atomism is basically the idea that epistemic agents are sort of interchangeable, right? They don't have sort of essential features different from the epistemic features of the situation. So I can plug in other people, and if they have the same evidence and maybe the same background beliefs and things like that, the same perceptions, then they are in the same position to know certain things that I am, right? It doesn't really matter which person is there, as long as we keep the epistemic situation, right? The evidence, the background beliefs, and so on, as long as we keep that stable. Okay, so how could we argue against intellectualism, against this idea that, what kind of knowledge you can get should surely only depend on things like evidence and not on other features of the people involved? Well, the first thing that Toole does to sort of push against intellectualism is not that she's going to explain standpoint epistemology in more detail, but that she takes another position which attacks intellectualism. And that other position is the position of those who are interested in pragmatic encroachment. Pragmatic encroachment. That's the idea that the pragmatics of the situation, so really the purposes and aims that people have in a certain situation, are relevant for determining whether they know something or not. And then so we get these two examples, right, of people who wonder, like they try to think through whether the bank is going to be open tomorrow. Right? Is the bank going to be open tomorrow on Saturday? And there's one person who doesn't have very pressing business at the bank, right? So there are no sort of real serious goals or stakes here. And they think, well, last week I was at the bank on Saturday, so probably they'll be open this Saturday too, right? And maybe we would be willing to say, well, this person knows that the bank will be open on Saturday because, they have pretty good evidence. They were there last week on Saturday and it was open, so pretty good evidence that it's going to be open this Saturday too. Yeah, sure, they know that the bank will be open tomorrow on Saturday. Here's another person, and this other person really needs to deposit some money, right? I mean, I'm gonna make the example more fun. I'm gonna make the example more extreme than it is in the paper. I'm gonna say that if this person doesn't make this payment to the mafia tomorrow, okay, I mean, really bad things are gonna happen to him. So he really has to be able to get to the bank and deposit this money. So this person too wonders, where is the bank open tomorrow? And he thinks, well, I was there last week on Saturday and it was open then, so I'll probably be open tomorrow. Wow, but here the stakes are so high that we would say, no, that's not knowledge, right? You need more evidence. You need to find out, phone them, whatever. And so the idea would be of this pragmatic encroachment that if the stakes get higher, the threshold for knowledge gets higher too. And so there's something non-epistemic, the stakes, the aims, which has an influence on, in this case, the threshold for when something counts as knowledge. And so depending on your aims or the stakes that are there for you in your life, people with the exact same evidence, well, one of them might count as knowing and one of them might count as not knowing. Okay. So the way that Toole is going to understand and explain standpoint epistemology to us is that it does something that is analogous to these pragmatic encroachment arguments. It's going to turn out to be the case that somebody's social identity can ensure that two people who have the exact same evidence and maybe even the same beliefs, still one of them knows something and the other doesn't know something. The example that Toole uses is the example of a real life case of a white policeman in the United States of America who sexually assaulted a whole series of black women. And so it took a long while for some of these victims to come forward, identify themselves to the police, and accuse this person. And one of the things that you could see in discussions about this case is that, of course, some people said, well, of course it took a long time for them to come forward because they were afraid that they wouldn't be believed by the police, right? Maybe they had good reasons to believe that they wouldn't be believed by the police. Maybe they had good reasons to believe that particular police force was either sexist or racist or, at least didn't take accusations made by black women as seriously, especially not when they were accusing somebody on the force itself. So the fact that they didn't come forward with these accusations until sometimes maybe years later, that doesn't diminish their plausibility, right? There are very good reasons why they wouldn't do that. Or somebody might say, well, why did they wait so long? I don't know. I mean, this generates doubts about the accusations, right? That's also something that people could say. Okay, in this particular case, the police officer in question was found guilty of lots of charges actually. So we're going to assume, for the purpose of the example, that the accusations are absolutely correct, that they're true. And now Toole introduces two people, a black woman and a white woman, who get the exact same evidence from the news about this case, right? And so both of them hear that there are these accusations by these black women who took a long time, sometimes, to come forward to the police. And some of them had criminal records. And the reporter ends the report by saying, well, it took very long and they had criminal records, so how can we know that they are believable, these accusations? And Toole suggests that these two women might very well react, and in this example they do react differently to this same body of evidence, right? Where the black woman says this to herself: I know those women were sexually assaulted. They took so long to report it because he's a cop and they are poor black women. They thought no one would believe them. And here's what the other woman, the white woman, says to herself. Well, those women have criminal records. They could be lying. I am in no position to know that they were sexually assaulted. Right? So the one woman, the black woman, says, I know that they were sexually assaulted. The white woman says, I am in no position to know that they were sexually assaulted. Toole's suggestion here is that, according to standpoint epistemology, one way to understand this situation is the following. Both of these women are right in what they say about what they can know. Right? This is very important. Right? Anyone, you don't need standpoint epistemology to say that maybe one of these women is right and the other is wrong. Right? Maybe they both ought to believe it, and if they believed it, they would both know, based on the evidence, that these women were sexually assaulted. Or you could say, again, from traditional epistemology, that given that they have the same evidence, maybe the evidence is inconclusive and they both don't know, right? But what Toole wants to say, using standpoint epistemology, is that given the different social identities of these two women, it could very well be the case that one of them knows it and the other is not in a position to know it, even though they have the same evidence. Right? So that's what makes it analogous to the pragmatic encroachment case. Right? In the pragmatic encroachment case, we have two people with the same evidence. One is high stakes, the other doesn't. The high stakes one doesn't know, the low stakes one does know. Here in this situation, we have two people with different social identities. They get the same evidence. One of them is in a position to know something based on the evidence. The other is not in a position to know something based on the evidence. Okay, how is that possible? Well, the What's the standpoint epistemologist has to do, of course, is tell us a story about how that would be possible. Before delving into that, Toole wonders what the intellectualists might make of a case like this, right? And the intellectualist might, for instance, say, well, actually, there are epistemic differences here, right? Maybe this black woman has different background beliefs from this white woman, right? And therefore she draws different conclusions. That could be true. And then maybe it's true that she knows something and the other woman doesn't know it because of the different background beliefs. Or maybe they have different standards for evidence. Okay, so Toole goes into that. I'm not going to go into that. I'll say a little bit about it. Let's say a little bit about it. So when it comes to background beliefs, I suppose one thing we could say about it is that, well, maybe they don't have different background beliefs, right? Maybe they really know the same things about the case and they know the same statistics and, that's a possibility. Let's add that to our example. When it comes to differences in evaluating the evidence, so how seriously we take different elements of the evidence, what Toole says is that, yeah, she actually agrees that that's probably going on, or that could be going on, right? That one woman evaluates the evidence in a different way from the other woman, but that these different standards of evidence have to do with their standpoint, right? With their social identity. So here's what she says about that. She said that this explanation is incomplete, as the epistemic standards that an epistemic agent adopts are partly constituted by non-epistemic features. I submit that in cases like the one described above, there is a tendency among dominantly situated knowers to be overly cautious and to favor avoiding false beliefs. By contrast, there is a tendency among marginally situated knowers to favor acquiring true beliefs. So this is a hypothesis that Toole doesn't explore in detail, but the idea would be that given different social identities, you might adopt different epistemic strategies. And so one pair of epistemic strategies that we often see contrasted in epistemology is being cautious, like trying to avoid false beliefs, and being bold, trying to gain true beliefs as quickly as possible. Well, it's clear that in different situations you would like to do different things, right? So if you are out in the jungle and you want to avoid being eaten by tigers, it's good to be bold in concluding that there's a tiger somewhere, right? Better to run away one time too often than to not run away one time too often. On the other hand, if I am a biologist looking for a new species, I should be very cautious, right? I don't want to sort of go to my colleagues and say, wow, this is a new species of beetle, and then it turns out that I acquired a false belief and it's not a new species of beetle, and they will laugh at me, right? That's where I will have a higher standard of evidence. So something like that might also be true when we think about social identity, right? If your social identity is such that you are in a very vulnerable place in society, then acquiring true beliefs about certain things might be very useful. Caution might be inadvisable. Whereas if you're in a very safe space in society, maybe you can afford to be cautious and, wait for more evidence to come in, and so on and so forth. So what Toole says about this, this deviation or these differences in epistemic standards is that, yeah, maybe that's an epistemic factor, but probably this epistemic factor has to be partially explained through non-epistemic factors. Okay. So the third section of the article is about the way that standpoint epistemologists can explain differences about knowledge in terms of differences about social identity. And Toole really offers three types of explanation, all of which, they don't compete with each other, right? They can be combined into a fuller explanation. So one thing is that different people from different social identities might have different conceptual resources. So they might know about different things. So here's one thing that could happen. The black woman in this case, who is, by the way, called Moira in the example, might know more about the way that black women are seen in culture in general. And so one of the things that might be happening, Toole says, is that there's this unfortunate tradition of thinking of black women as being somehow more promiscuous, right? I mean, they're supposed to have looser morals than white women. Well, and if that's the case, then you might think that they probably encourage this guy or something like that. Knowing that this is the kind of thing that's going on, right? Knowing that that is how people might look at black women or how parts of society might view them, allows you to understand, the kinds of problems that those women run into, and especially in situations like these, and so gives you a better idea as to why they wouldn't come forward to the police, right? Because they themselves know, and you, having experienced this yourself, if you are a black woman, might know what's going to happen or what is likely to happen in a situation like these, right? So your better understanding of the situation could take the form of having certain concepts or certain knowledge that are not available or not as available to somebody in a different social position with a different social identity. So that's the conceptual resources. Second thing is that, we might also come up with different hypotheses, right? It's possible that based on, our experience, which stems from having a certain social identity, we might be able to come up with different ideas to explain what's going on. And so here's an example that Toole discusses. There's I don't know whether she discusses it in precisely this part of the paper, but it's an interesting example. So there's this psychological research that was done like decades ago on spatial reasoning, like spatial insights in men and women. And so people would be asked to sit in this, dark lab with some male scientist making notes, and they would have to do visual tasks. And women were worse at them than men, right? And so the psychologists conclude, well, women have less spatial insight than men. And Toole says, well, maybe there was something else going on, right? Maybe they were just nervous sitting in a dark lab with this unknown guy next to them making notes, right? That's something, she suggests, that a woman who has been in that type of situation might have a much easier time to come up with as an hypothesis than these male scientists who never had to sort of, live through that kind of experience. So your social identity might allow you to come up with certain hypotheses more easily. All right, finally, and this is where Toole thinks is like the most important thing, maybe, certainly, where she says, well, this is my own contribution to this discussion. It's the case that, like, your social identity might involve having certain de se knowledge, like knowledge from yourself, from your own experience, that can be used as a tool to imaginatively grasp the first-personal perspective of another epistemic agent. And the idea is really, in a sense, very simple, right? If you have experienced certain situations, it's a lot easier to grasp what it was like for somebody else to be in that situation, right? And so your social identity, which of course has a lot to do with the kind of experiences that you can have, might put you into a much better situation to understand somebody else's perspective, and therefore to understand why somebody else did something or didn't do something. And so the simple fact that you are, like, in terms of your social identity, more like another person might put you in a better situation to understand and explain and have, like, a good grasp of why they did certain things, right? And, well, if that's the case, then of course it's possible that in this situation where we have a white woman and a black woman listening to this testimony of black women, that the black woman might just have a better position to understand why these women did what they did, and therefore to gain knowledge from that testimony and to gain knowledge about this situation. All right. So those are three ways in which one's social identity could impact one's ability to gain knowledge. As far as I know, right, at least in this article, Toole doesn't argue that any of these barriers are sort of that they can't be overcome, right? She doesn't argue here that if your social identity is different, you're unable to get this knowledge, right? It seems to be the case, well, at least insofar as she argues it here, that like in the same situation with the same evidence, like one person might have knowledge and the other might not have knowledge, but she's not claiming here that there's some like uncrossable barrier, right? That getting more evidence, or maybe even like the one person talking to the other person, right, and hearing about their perspective, that might not be enough to get them over to knowledge too, right? And I think that would be a sort of hopeful and helpful way of using standpoint epistemology. So I don't think there's any relativism going on here, right? It's not the case that there's the knowledge of one group and the knowledge of another group. It's the case that depending on your social identity, in a particular epistemic situation, you might be better positioned to gain knowledge than another person, or worse positioned to gain knowledge than another person. All right, so that's the argument of the paper, and then at the very end, Toole tells us that the traditional epistemologists can kind of do two things, right? They can reject intellectualism and say, okay, non-epistemic factors do play a role, or, and this is maybe just a terminological difference, they can say, aha, well, there's much more epistemic factors than we thought, right? Somebody's social identity is also maybe an epistemic factor in one way or another. But whichever of these two things you choose, and again, maybe it's just a terminological difference, it turns out that in order to tell the whole story about knowledge, we have to take a broader look, right? It's not just about evidence and background beliefs, it's also about the life that you've lived, the role that you have in society, and so on and so forth. Thank you.